Ghost with Cats, Chapter 20, Silent Night. It was after midnight. The stars looked like diamonds over the crystalline white landscape as Annie went out to the cavern pool for one last swim. She hadn't been to the retreat since before her parents died, and she felt she wouldn't be back for a very long time. It all seemed so strange. She floated in the warm mineral water as she remembered coming here when she was little. Rabbi Jacob still had hair then. Well, a little hair. Her father was in the was an Air Force officer then. She remembered the summer a tall, dark-haired man who always wore long-sleeved flannel shirts and sunglasses lived in the caretaker's cavern with his little brother. She couldn't remember their names, but she was certain it was true and tall. It was so strange to realize her mother, who always loved and cherished her, also loved and cherished the one she had fallen in love with. She breathed out and let herself sink to the bottom of the pool. Laying there, Annie admitted to herself she was in love with Vance Tall, someone she should absolutely not be in love with, someone who was not even of her world. She knew the stories from Opir about how the sons of the angels had chosen among the daughters of the princes, and their children were allegedly the mighty men and wise women of legends. He believed True was one of these legendary beings, similar to what rabbis Isaac and Jacob believed. The descendants of Abraham, despite thousands of years of conflict, were still being chosen to be contacted by those who dwelt in the heavens. She floated herself back up and inhaled slowly. It was all so crazy. But what wasn't crazy was that her dead parents' research had been used to lure Tall here, and she needed to make it right by getting him and his servants off her world alive. A flash of light caught her eye. A straight line of green swept across the room through the mist. Quietly, she inhaled and sank again, swimming silently to the furthest end of the pool. She quietly surfaced, grateful she hadn't turned on the pool lights, and praying whoever it was didn't know how to. There was only one. He wore privatized military gear, with his calm silent as he moved past her carelessly. He didn't think anyone would be here, alone at this time of night with no lights on. His careless attitude gave her a chance. She cursed herself. It was stupid to come here empty-handed. Rule for survival number 1. Always have your tools. The mercenary hung out by the door, smoking, obviously not wanting to leave the warm cavern for the single-digit temperature of the night air. Her robe hung in the changing room next to her towel. Her boots were carelessly tossed under a bench, and she hoped mostly out of sight. She slipped quietly out of the water, berating herself for succumbing to the temptation to swim naked in the luxurious water in the middle of the night, as she and her mother often had. She needed to get past him, acquire a weapon, and his calm. She heard his calm chirp as she stood behind him. Gate secure. Stables clear. Cabin clear. Garage clear. Pool clear, the man in front of her said. Close on house. 6 voices answered, including her gatekeeper. Confirm, close on house. She was shaking, but he hadn't noticed her taking the knife from the back of his gear belt. Rule for survival number 4. You are the only one who will save yourself. He clicked off his comm and turned to throw his cigarette in the pool, but paused. There was a naked young woman wearing only a necklace standing there. She blinked at him with large doe eyes. Rule number 3 for daily life. Pretend to be the person they expect. Hello, she said, smiling, faking being a clueless private resort guest, then asked, Are you with security? Sure, I'm security, he lied, looking her up and down, noting that her body was toned, but also softly curved with full breast. Where's the towels? Didn't housekeeping send you with more towels? She asked innocently, in a high, childish voice. Towels? He wondered how many years below legal she was. Didn't they send you to bring more towels? Yeah, there and there, he lied, pointing at the changing room. Thanks. The naked girl bounced past him into the changing room and quickly turned to the side. He shrugged and followed, clicking off his comm. They only had orders to bring the 3 men, the aliens. He thought malevolently about what he was going to do to the girl. Then he was surprised by his throat being cut by his own tactical knife. Before he was stabbed in the back of the head. As he lay there, bleeding out on the floor, a shaking Annie puked and sobbed. She pulled the comm earpiece and turned it on to listen. They were closing on the house. She grabbed her robe, wrapping it tightly around her, and sat down to pull on her boots. Her mind screamed for Tal to hear her as she prayed, Please, Tal, wake up. You're in danger. Wake up. Rule for survival number 3. Always expect the worst, prepare for the worst, and pray for the best. She took the man's weapons, careful not to look at his blood again. It smelled awful, and she wanted to puke again, but instead she slipped out into the frigid darkness and carefully ran back toward the house. Annie needed to get to the house ahead of the mercenaries and warn the Eloh the enemy had found them. Tal sat up in bed. He awakened from a nightmare. He had never had a nightmare before. Annie was swimming, and the water turned to blood. Then she screamed for him to wake up. His mind reached out to her room down the hall to see if she was having one of her nightmares. But she wasn't there. She wasn't in the house. Others were. Silently he rose and lifted the sword from its case. His mind touched Vorn and Brees. Both woke up instantly. Annie was at the pool. She was armed and on her way back to the house. Boaz was awake in his house, hidden under the floor of the tiny caretaker's cabin as men searched it. Tal stood behind the door when a man opened it. Silently, the folded steel blade ended the mercenary. Tal laid the man behind the closet door, then stepped out into the dark hall and looked over the rail. The invaders were wearing strange headgear to see. He dropped silently to the first floor. It took 6 steps to reach and kill the one there. 8 more steps, and the one by the front door was also dead. He pulled the bodies out of the open easily and into the office to hide them. A 4th opened the door, but Tal closed it after him. His sword killed that one without a sound as well. He could hear the sound of Breeze's crushing blow to one, and knew Vorn's two victims died completely silently. The rear door opened, a slight scuff of boots being dropped, and bare feet quietly stepped across the tile of the kitchen. Sprinting, Tall caught Annie, pulling her away from the base of the stairs moments before two armed men stepped to the top of the stairs. Quietly, they stood in the coat nook in the back of the kitchen's mudroom. Tall could feel Annie trembling. He couldn't tell if she was cold or scared. She pulled his head down by hers. Their ears touched, and he realized she had acquired one of their communication devices. They listened as the intruders sounded confused. Their handlers wanted to know why they hadn't found the aliens yet. Part of their team was missing. There was a tap on the window. It was Boaz. Annie made some hand signals at him that he seemed to understand. He made some back. She nodded, and he slipped away. 4 more in the woods approaching the house, 2 on the road by the gate. Boaz says come to the pool. He breathed out against Tall's ear. It tickled, but oddly he enjoyed it, like he enjoyed having her in his arms. Tall knew there were still at least 2 in the house. He needed to think about them, but he was struggling to focus. Suddenly she added, embarrassed, I need to get some clothes. Are you serious? He whispered back harshly. He looked down at Annie in the moonlight and realized she was only wearing a wet robe and her cat pendant. He was not expecting that, or the sight of her firm cleavage pressed against his naked chest. This was not the time to be distracted, but his predator didn't care, as his breath and his focus left him. A nearly naked female running around a battle was not something Vance Tall ever dealt with, ever trained to deal with, or even imagined having to deal with, not in his 16 years as an admant. Females were never allowed near a battle. In the kingdom of Eloh, they were too few, too valuable. And yet, in his arms was one who was not only armed and participating in the battle, but also doing so in only a robe and her pendant. His world was so different from hers, and he never realized just how different until now. Tall breathed out slowly and forced his mind back into tactical mode. On the porch, there were footsteps. He took her hand and they fled silently to the study with its spiral staircase to the upstairs loft. Tall breathed out slowly and forced his mind back into tactical mode. On the porch, there were footsteps. He took her hand and they silently fled to the study with its spiral staircase to the upstairs loft. There was a creak above them. He started to pull her back, but she shook her head and signaled him to come upstairs to the loft. Silently, he trailed her up the stairs. What she did next shocked him. Annie peeked around the corner at the enemy. There were 2 checking the rooms on this level. She needed to lure them back here without getting shot. Rule for survival number 2. Always have a plan, another plan, and an exit strategy. After dropping the assault R-79 in a chair, she worked at tucking a handgun inside her robe where it was secure and invisible. She flipped her wet hair, making it fuller, and, for a few moments, completely exposed her breast. Tall stared at her in disbelief, not moving as she retied and loosened the neck of her robe, so it hung seductively off one shoulder. She twisted it so her opposite thigh showed, making it obvious she was wearing little or nothing under the robe. He had never noticed how tiny her waist or curved the shape of her body was. She always wore so many layers of clothing. He had not paid attention to what she wore to the pool the other day. Her body was as beautiful as her soul. He swallowed, fighting down the urging of his predator to bite and ink her for his own, to breed her and to kill all who threatened what it wanted as theirs, like a raging animal. "Be ready," she whispered before peeking around the corner again. Tall shifted nervously in the darkness. "Annalise?" "What?" she demanded harshly, but quietly, sensing his reluctance to ask. He whispered quietly, "Do you mean to make yourself look desirable?" In the darkness, he could see her clearly and was aware that she must not realize how clearly, because she rolled her eyes at him. She stepped closer, and he could see down her robe from the ample curve of her breast to her navel. He had never wanted a female the way he wanted her at this moment. It was completely irrational. She leaned toward him and angrily whispered, "That's the point, you twit! They have night vision gear. They can see me. They will think I'm some helpless girl who just woke up. I'll lure them back here, and you take care of them with your sword, okay? If I shoot them, it'll make too much noise." He just nodded. She was naked under the robe, his inner predator reminded him, and Tull forced himself to breathe, telling his predator that its needs would have to wait for another time. He must protect her now. She slipped down the hall behind the two men and opened the door like she wandered out into the hall. The bed in Vaughan's room was unmade, and she was petite enough to be easily hidden by the disheveled comforter. "What's going on?" she mumbled sleepily, rubbing her eyes. The men turned to face her, then lowered their guns. "Hello, gorgeous. Just be a good girl and be quiet, and you won't get hurt," one said. "Too much," the other laughed. "You're not wearing much. Why don't you just hand over your robe so we don't have to get rough when we search you?" Both chuckled more. Annie made a frightened squeak and turned to flee, running toward the loft. They chased her right into Tull's blade. Slipping past them, she ran back to her room, past the top of the stairs. Another one saw her flee into her room from the middle of the stairs and hurriedly followed, revealing over the comms there was a naked girl in a robe upstairs. He did not see Tull in the loft at the other end of the hall dispatching his companions, or that Brice was watching him from the bathroom door. The intruder followed Annie into her room and closed the door behind him. The handlers were yelling at them to quit chasing the half-naked girl and find the aliens. Brice heard a muffled thump as he crushed the heads of the two who came rushing up the stairs behind the one who followed Annie into her room. He felt he must protect her. When Brice opened her door, he was surprised to see the man lying on the floor. There was a blanket over him, and feathers floating in the air from one of her pillows. It had a bullet hole through it. Annie was getting dressed quickly. She put her fingers to her lips. She pointed at her pack. Brice nodded and held up his, Vaughan, and Tull's packs. "And the sword case." She nodded and signaled to go out. They closed the door quietly behind them. At the end of the balcony, they watched Tull soundlessly drop to the first floor between another two intruders who entered from the front door. Neither even fired a shot. In the darkness, Annie could see Breeze's wide grin. Tall, Vorn stepped out of the shadows. Your boots and coat, master. I have completely wiped all traces of our presence here. Very good, Vorn. We are to meet Boaz at the pool. There are still 2 out there. Be wary, Tall cautioned. Annie was pulling the night vision gear off one of the intruders. Do you want a set? She asked, trying not to gag as she wiped the blood off her hand before she started dumping the weapons from the dead mercenaries into an empty carry sack. We do not require such devices, my lady, Vorn responded as he too gathered the dead mercenaries' weapons. She inhaled sharply, staring wide-eyed at Tall. He could see her blush in the darkness. You don't? She squeaked. Just to goad her for causing his lapse in concentration during the battle, Tall responded coolly, I regret nothing. Oh, oh, I am going to make you pay, Admant Vance Tall. She drawled in a deadly tone and glared up at him. She didn't think she had ever been more embarrassed or angry in her life. For a moment, feeling the rage radiating off her, Tall was partially fearful of the tiny human female's revenge. He knew she meant every word, but his predator seemed happy with her determination and ferocity.